plate shattered against the marble floor before Eleanor could even flinch. "Pick it up," Duke Alistair Blackthorne said, his voice cold enough to freeze the wine in every glass at the long banquet table. "Or are you too heavy to bend down anymore?" Laughter rippled through the hall. Not loud laughter, not cruel enough to draw attention from the servants standing near the walls, but the kind of quiet, polite laughter that hurt more, because it pretended to be nothing at all. Eleanor knelt and gathered the broken pieces of porcelain with steady hands. Her face did not change. She had learned years ago that her father fed on reactions, that tears only made him crueler, and silence only made him bored enough to stop. So she stayed silent, and she stayed still, and she picked up every last shard of the plate she had not even broken. Duke Alistair had thrown it himself. He often did. "Camille would never embarrass this family the way you do, simply by existing," he said, lifting his glass toward his younger daughter, who sat beside him in a gown the color of spring leaves. Camille smiled the smile of someone who had been told she was beautiful so many times that she believed it was a fact of nature, like the sun rising each morning. "Father," Camille said softly, though her eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction, "you shouldn't be so harsh." It was not kindness. Eleanor knew her sister well enough to hear the performance underneath the words. Camille wanted the room to see her as gentle, as the good daughter, the one who tried to defend her poor unfortunate sister. It made the contrast sharper. It made Eleanor look worse simply by comparison, and that was exactly the point. Eleanor rose to her feet, holding the broken porcelain in a napkin. 22 years old, and she had spent every one of those years learning how to disappear inside a room full of people who were staring directly at her. "I apologize for the disturbance," she said, her voice even. "I will have it cleaned up." She turned to leave, and that was when she heard her father's voice rise again, sharper this time, meant to be heard by every guest, still whispering behind their hands. "Do you see this?" Duke Alistair said, gesturing toward her retreating back with his wineglass. "This is what happens when a mother dies too young to raise a daughter properly. No discipline, no restraint, just excess, in every possible way." Eleanor did not stop walking. She had heard this particular cruelty before, dressed in different words but always carrying the same blade. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 6 years old, and in the 16 years since, the Duke had remarried twice, fathered Camille with his second wife, and never once let Eleanor forget that her existence was, in his eyes, a mistake he was forced to keep feeding and clothing. She reached the corridor outside the banquet hall and finally allowed her shoulders to drop, just slightly, just for a moment where no one could see. The napkin in her hands trembled faintly, not from sadness, from the effort of holding herself together for so many hours at a table designed to remind her, again and again, that she did not belong at it. "Miss Eleanor." She turned to find Grace Linden hurrying toward her, one of the few servants in the household who still looked at Eleanor, as though she were a person, and not a family embarrassment to be managed. Grace had been with the household since Eleanor was a child, and something in her had never learned to be as cold as the rest of the Blackthorne estate demanded. "You shouldn't have seen that," Eleanor said, setting the broken porcelain onto a side table. "I've seen it before," Grace said gently. "That doesn't make it right." Eleanor managed something close to a smile. "Nothing about this house is right. We simply learned to live inside it anyway." Grace's expression tightened, but she said nothing further. There was nothing to say that would not risk her position, and Eleanor would never ask her to risk it. Instead, Grace reached out and squeezed Eleanor's hand briefly, before returning to her duties, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet corridor, with only the muffled sound of laughter still drifting from the hall behind her. She walked toward the east wing of the estate, where her rooms were located, deliberately far from the rest of the family's quarters. It had been her father's decision, made years ago, framed as a matter of practicality, but understood by everyone in the household as a matter of preference. He did not want to pass her door. He did not want to be reminded, each morning, that she existed under his roof. Her room was simple compared to the extravagance of the rest of the estate. A modest bed, a writing desk, shelves lined with books she had read more times than she could count, because books did not care what she looked like. Books did not flinch or sneer or compare her to anyone. They simply told their stories, over and over, patient and unchanging, and Eleanor had found more comfort in them over the years than she had found in almost any person she had known. She sat at her desk and pulled open the drawer where she kept her private ledger. a habit she had developed quietly over the past 2 years. While her father assumed she understood nothing of the estate's finances, Eleanor had, in fact, taught herself to read account books, to understand where money moved and where it disappeared. It had started as a way to pass the long, lonely hours. It had become something closer to genuine skill. She noted, not for the first time, that several of the estate's recent expenses did not add up cleanly. Money spent on renovations that no one had seen completed. Payments to men whose names she did not recognize. She did not yet understand what it meant, only that something about her father's management of the family's wealth felt less careful than it should have. She closed the ledger and told herself, as she always did, that it was not her place to ask questions no one wanted answered. A knock came at her door. "Enter," she said, expecting Grace again, perhaps with a tray of food she had missed by leaving the banquet early. Instead, it was Camille who stepped inside, still wearing her spring green gown, her expression composed into something that resembled concern, but did not quite reach it. "Are you well?" Camille asked.
"I am fine."
"Father can be difficult," Camille said, moving further into the room, her eyes drifting over the modest furnishings, with something like curiosity, as though she rarely had reason to visit this part of the house. "You mustn't take it too personally." Eleanor said nothing. There was very little she could say to Camille that would not eventually be repeated, in some altered form, back to their father. It was a lesson she had learned slowly and painfully over many years. "I only came to remind you," Camille continued, her voice light, almost cheerful, "that your engagement to Lord Hallow will be formalized next month. Father wants everything arranged before the season ends." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her desk. She had known the engagement was coming, had known for months that her father intended to settle her future with a minor lord from a struggling estate, a man twice her age who needed her family's money far more than he could ever need her. It was not a match built on affection. It was a transaction, arranged the way one might arrange the sale of an unwanted piece of furniture, simply to be rid of it, while still gaining some benefit from the exchange. "I am aware," Eleanor said quietly. Camille studied her for a moment, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been pity, or might have been satisfaction. Eleanor could never quite tell which. "Well, I only wanted you to hear it from me, rather than from Father directly." "Thank you," Eleanor said, though she felt no gratitude at all. When Camille left, Eleanor sat in the silence of her room for a long while, listening to the faint sounds of the household settling into evening, servants moving through corridors, distant laughter still echoing faintly from wherever the guests had gathered after dinner. She thought of Lord Hallow, a man she had met only twice, both times briefly, both times aware that his interest in her had far more to do with her family's wealth than with anything about her as a person. She thought, too, of her mother, whose portrait hung in a small frame on Eleanor's desk, one of the only possessions of hers that Eleanor had been permitted to keep. Her mother had kind eyes in the painting, soft and warm, nothing like the sharp, assessing gazes Eleanor had grown used to receiving from nearly everyone else in her life. "I wonder what you would think of all this," Eleanor whispered to the portrait, though she knew no answer would come. Outside, the estate's many windows glowed with warm light, hosting a celebration that had never once, in all her years, felt like it belonged to her. Eleanor undressed slowly, folded her dress with careful precision, and lay down in the darkness of her modest room, listening to laughter she was not part of, in a house that had never once felt like home. Tomorrow, she knew, would look much the same as today. Her father would find some new fault, some fresh comparison to Camille, some sharper way to remind her of her place. She had grown so used to the pattern that she rarely expected anything different anymore. She could not have known, as she closed her eyes that night, that the following week would bring an errand to the capital, a small and unremarkable task her father would assign, simply because no one else was available, and that this small errand would place her, quite by accident, in the path of a man the entire kingdom had been talking about for months. A man who had turned away every beautiful woman presented to him, and who no one, not even Eleanor herself, expected to look twice at a duke's despised, overlooked, forgotten first daughter. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight there was only silence, and the ceiling above her bed, and the quiet ache of another day, survived rather than lived. The morning air was cool when Eleanor climbed into the modest carriage assigned for her errand, a folder of documents pressed against her chest. Her father had barely looked up from his desk when he gave the order. "Deliver these to the merchant office near the harbor district," Duke Alistair had said, "and do not dawdle. I have no patience for excuses today." It was, in truth, a task meant for a clerk, not for the eldest daughter of a noble house. But Eleanor had learned that her father assigned her such errands deliberately, small humiliations dressed up as duty, reminders that she was useful only for the tasks no one else wanted to do. She did not argue. She rarely did. Arguing only invited longer, louder lectures, and she preferred the quiet efficiency of simply completing what was asked and returning to the safety of her room. The carriage rattled through the streets of the capital, past markets bursting with color, past children chasing each other around fruit carts, past the grand stone buildings where the kingdom's business was conducted each day. Eleanor watched it all through the small window, feeling, as she often did outside the walls of her father's estate, a strange sense of freedom. No one here knew her. No one here compared her to Camille, or sighed at the sight of her. She was simply a young woman in a carriage, unremarkable and unbothered, and there was a quiet peace in that anonymity she rarely found elsewhere. The merchant office took less time than expected. The documents were delivered, signed, and returned within the hour, and Eleanor found herself with unexpected free time before the carriage was due to collect her again. She decided, on a small and uncharacteristic impulse, to walk toward a tea house she had heard Grace mention once, tucked along a quieter street near the harbor, known for serving excellent tea to anyone who could afford a modest cup, regardless of their name or title. The tea house was warm and softly lit, filled with the low hum of conversation and the smell of steeped leaves and fresh bread. Eleanor found a small table near the window and ordered a simple cup of tea, grateful for a moment that belonged entirely to herself. She had barely taken her first sip when a voice spoke from beside her table. "Forgive me, but is this seat taken?" She looked up to find a tall man standing there, dressed simply, but with clear quality in the cut of his coat, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been out walking for some time. The tea house was crowded, every other table full, and it was not an unreasonable request. Still, something about the directness of his gaze made Eleanor pause before answering. "It is not," she said. "You are welcome to it." He sat down with an easy, unhurried grace, setting a small notebook on the table beside his own cup of tea. For a while, neither of them spoke, and Eleanor returned her attention to the window, watching people pass along the street outside. "You looked troubled when you sat down," the man said eventually, not looking up from his notebook. "Though you're doing a fine job of hiding it now." Eleanor turned to him, faintly surprised. That is a bold thing to say to a stranger. Perhaps. He glanced up, and there was something warm and unguarded in his expression, nothing like the calculating looks she was used to receiving from nobles at her father's table. "I find that strangers are often more honest with each other than people who already know one another's histories. There's no performance required." "An interesting philosophy. One I've found useful," he said, smiling slightly. "My name is Julian." "Eleanor," she offered, deciding there was little harm in a first name shared between two people unlikely to cross paths again. "Well, Eleanor," Julian said, setting down his pen, "what troubles you on such a fine morning?" She considered deflecting the question, as she usually did with anyone who asked too directly about her feelings. But something about the anonymity of the moment, the fact that this man knew nothing of her family, her title, or the weight she carried simply by being who she was, made her answer more honestly than she expected to. "I am to be married soon," she said, "to a man I hardly know, for reasons that have very little to do with either of us, and a great deal to do with my family's convenience." Julian's expression shifted, something thoughtful crossing his face. "That sounds like a heavy thing to carry alone." "It is simply how these arrangements are made," Eleanor said, though even to her own ears the words sounded more resigned than she intended. "I've had a great deal of practice accepting things I cannot change." "Practice doesn't always make peace," Julian said quietly. "Sometimes it only makes silence." Eleanor looked at him properly then, studying the calm intelligence in his eyes, the way he seemed to listen not to respond, but to actually understand. It was such an unfamiliar experience, being truly listened to, that she found herself unable to look away for a moment longer than was polite. "You speak like someone who has thought about this a great deal," she said. "I've watched a lot of arrangements made for reasons that had nothing to do with the people inside them," Julian said. "It's not a pattern I admire." They spoke for nearly an hour after that, about small things at first, the quality of the tea, the noise of the harbor district, the strange habits of pigeons that gathered outside the window. But slowly, the conversation deepened, and Eleanor found herself sharing thoughts she rarely voiced aloud, not the specifics of her family, not names or titles, but the quieter truths beneath them. The loneliness of being endlessly compared, the exhaustion of shrinking herself in rooms full of people who had already decided who she was before she ever spoke a word. Julian, in turn, spoke of his own frustrations, though carefully, without revealing much about his own circumstances. He spoke of meeting people who seemed to want him only for what he could offer them, of growing tired of conversations that felt rehearsed rather than real. Eleanor found herself nodding along, recognizing pieces of her own experience reflected back at her from someone whose life, on the surface, seemed entirely different from hers. "You're easy to talk to," Julian said eventually, glancing at the small clock mounted above the tea-house counter. "I don't say that often." "Neither am I, usually," Eleanor admitted. "I don't know what it is about today." "Maybe it's simply that neither of us expected this conversation," Julian said, "so neither of us prepared a performance for it." Eleanor smiled, a real smile, the kind she rarely allowed herself in front of anyone outside of Grace. Perhaps that's exactly it. Their time together ended when Eleanor noticed the position of the sun through the window and realized, with a small jolt of alarm, that her carriage would be waiting. She rose quickly, gathering her things, aware of a strange reluctance to leave that she did not fully understand. "I should go," she said. "My carriage will be waiting, and I cannot afford to be late returning." Julian rose as well, something unreadable in his expression. "Will I see you again?" Eleanor hesitated. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight she was not prepared for. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "My life is rather arranged for me, most days." "Then I hope," Julian said, "that today was one of the days that wasn't." She left the tea-house with her heart beating a little faster than it should have, walking briskly toward the harbor where her carriage waited. She did not look back, though some small part of her wanted to. By the time she settled into her seat for the ride home, she told herself firmly that it had simply been a pleasant, unremarkable conversation with a stranger, the kind of small kindness one occasionally received in a life otherwise short on it, and nothing more than that. She did not know, could not have known, that the man she had spoken to so freely that morning was Julian Ashworth, the wealthiest and most talked-about bachelor in the entire kingdom, a man whose refusal of every noblewoman presented to him had become the subject of endless gossip in every drawing room from the capital to the coast. She did not know that he had left the tea-house that morning thinking of nothing else, turning their conversation over in his mind again and again, wondering who the woman with the tired eyes and the honest words truly was, and whether he would ever have the chance to find out. She returned home that evening to find her father in a foul mood over some unrelated matter, and the small warmth of the morning's conversation faded quickly beneath the familiar weight of the household's usual coldness. She ate dinner in silence, endured another round of comparisons to Camille, and retired early to her room, telling herself that whatever had passed between herself and the stranger named Julian was simply a pleasant memory, nothing more, a single bright hour in an otherwise gray life. She could not have guessed that across the city, in a grand study lined with books and ledgers, Julian sat awake long past midnight, instructing a trusted aide to quietly discover the name and household of a young woman he had met only that morning, a woman whose honesty had struck him more deeply than any carefully arranged introduction ever had. Nor could she have guessed that her own father, still smarting from the social slights of recent months, had begun making quiet arrangements of his own, hoping to place Camille directly in the path of the very man Eleanor had unknowingly already met. Two paths, moving toward each other without either side fully understanding the collision that was coming. Oliver Bennett had worked for Julian Ashworth for nearly 6 years, long enough to know when his employer was serious about something and when he was simply curious. This was different from both. Julian had returned from his morning walk 3 days earlier, with an unusual quiet about him, distracted through an important meeting with a shipping partner, and had asked, almost in passing, whether Oliver might discover the name of a young woman who frequented a tea-house near the harbor district. It had taken Oliver 2 days to learn her name. It took him only a few hours more to learn who her father was, and when he brought the information to Julian's study, he watched his employer's expression shift from mild curiosity to something far more complicated. Eleanor Blackthorne, Julian repeated slowly, sitting back in his chair. The Duke's eldest daughter. The very same, Oliver confirmed. Though from what I understand, she is rarely spoken of in the same circles as her half-sister. There have been unflattering rumors about how the Duke regards her. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. He thought of the woman he had met, her honest words, her tired eyes, the quiet dignity with which she had spoken of an arranged marriage she clearly did not want. He thought, too, of the rumors that had reached even his own household in recent weeks. Whispers about Duke Blackthorne's coldness toward his firstborn daughter. Whispers he had previously dismissed as the kind of exaggerated gossip that circulated endlessly through noble society. "Tell me what you know of her engagement," Julian said. "Arranged and set to be formalized within the month," Oliver said. "To a Lord Hallow, a man with significant debts and very little else to offer. It is, by every account, a transaction rather than a match." Julian said nothing for a long moment, staring at the papers on his desk without truly seeing them. He had spent the better part of 2 years turning away women who had been presented to him with practiced smiles and carefully rehearsed conversation. Women whose families had clearly instructed them on exactly what to say and how to say it. Women who spoke of his wealth more often than they spoke of anything genuine. He had grown so tired of it that he had nearly resigned himself to the idea that he might never find a conversation that felt real, a connection that wasn't shaped entirely around what he could offer someone. And then, entirely by accident, in a tea house he had wandered into simply because he wanted a moment away from his own household, he had found exactly that. A woman who had not known who he was. A woman who had spoken honestly, without performance, about her own unhappiness, without once asking about his fortune or his family name. "Arrange a formal introduction to House Blackthorne," Julian said finally. "I want to meet with the Duke." Oliver raised an eyebrow slightly. "May I ask your purpose, sir?" Julian considered the question for a moment before answering. "I want to see this household for myself, and I want to understand exactly what kind of man would call his own daughter an embarrassment simply for existing." 3 days later, an invitation arrived at the Blackthorne estate, sealed with the crest of House Ashworth, requesting a formal visit from Julian Ashworth himself. Duke Alistair Blackthorne read the letter twice before allowing himself to smile. "Finally," he said, setting the letter down with something close to triumph. "The wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom, requesting an introduction to our household. Camille, my dear, this is your moment." Camille, seated across the drawing room, with a piece of needlework in her lap, looked up with carefully composed delight. "You believe he means to court me?" "Why else would a man of his standing request such a visit?" the Duke said, already imagining the alliance, the wealth, the social standing such a match would bring to the Blackthorne name. "You will wear the blue silk gown, the one from the capital tailor. And Eleanor," he added, almost as an afterthought, his tone shifting immediately from excitement to dismissal, "will remain in her rooms during the visit. There is no need to trouble our guest with unnecessary distractions." Eleanor, who had been sitting quietly near the window during this exchange, said nothing. She had grown accustomed to being excluded from important gatherings, treated as something to be hidden away rather than presented, and though the words still stung faintly, she no longer expected anything different. The day of Julian's visit arrived with the entire household in a state of careful preparation. Servants polished silver that had not seen use in months. The kitchen staff prepared an elaborate spread of refreshments, and Camille spent nearly 2 hours with her lady's maid, ensuring every detail of her appearance was perfect. Duke Alistair paced the entrance hall, checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency as the appointed hour approached. Eleanor, confined to her rooms as instructed, sat at her writing desk with a book open in front of her, though she found it impossible to focus on the words. Something about the household's excitement felt strange to her, though she could not have said exactly why. She told herself it did not matter. Whoever this wealthy visitor was, his presence had nothing to do with her, and she had no reason to think of it further. Downstairs, the carriage arrived precisely on time. Duke Alistair greeted his guest personally at the entrance, his voice warm with the particular enthusiasm he reserved only for people he believed could benefit him. "Lord Ashworth," the Duke said, extending a hand. "What an honor to welcome you to our home." Julian shook the offered hand with polite formality, though his eyes moved briefly across the entrance hall, taking in the grandeur of the estate with quiet assessment rather than admiration. "Duke Blackthorne, thank you for receiving me on such short notice." Not at all, not at all. Please, come through to the drawing room. My daughter is eager to make your acquaintance. Julian followed the Duke through the estate's ornate corridors, and it was as they walked that he found himself studying the household more carefully than his host likely realized. He noted the portraits lining the walls, each one carefully positioned to display the family's wealth and lineage. He noted, too, the absence of any portrait that might have belonged to a mother who had died too young, or to a daughter the household clearly preferred not to acknowledge. In the drawing room, Camille rose gracefully to greet him, executing a perfect curtsy, her smile calibrated precisely to suggest warmth without appearing overeager. Lord Ashworth, it is truly a pleasure. Miss Blackthorne, Julian said, returning the greeting with polite formality, though something in his tone remained carefully neutral. They sat, and the conversation proceeded much as Julian had come to expect from such visits. Camille spoke with practiced charm about music and literature, about recent social events, about the beauty of the estate's gardens in the current season. It was pleasant enough, competent enough, but entirely lacking the honesty that had struck him so deeply during his conversation at the tea house. He found his attention drifting, his mind returning again and again to a woman with tired eyes, who had spoken of her unhappiness, without any attempt to disguise it as something more palatable. "Tell me," Julian said eventually, during a brief pause in Camille's description of a recent concert, "does your household include any other family members? I understand there may be an elder sister." The temperature of the room shifted almost immediately. Duke Alistair's easy smile tightened at the edges, and Camille's composed expression flickered, just briefly, before smoothing itself back into place. "My elder sister," Camille said carefully, "keeps to herself, mostly. She isn't much for company. She has never had much interest in social gatherings," Duke Alistair added quickly, his tone dismissive, in a way that told Julian more than either of them likely intended. "A rather private sort of person. I doubt she would have much to offer a conversation such as this." Julian said nothing further on the matter, though he filed the exchange away carefully, alongside everything Oliver had already told him. He continued the visit with polite conversation, allowing Camille to guide most of the discussion, but his mind remained elsewhere, turning over the strange discomfort that had crossed both the Duke's and Camille's faces at the simple mention of Eleanor's existence. As the visit drew toward its conclusion, Julian rose to take his leave, thanking his hosts for their hospitality with the same measured formality he had maintained throughout. But as he moved toward the entrance hall, he paused deliberately near a window that overlooked a quiet garden path, and there, walking slowly among the roses with a book held loosely in one hand, was the woman from the tea house. Eleanor had stepped outside for a brief walk, unaware that the household's important guest was still within view, seeking only a few minutes of fresh air before returning to the confinement of her rooms. She did not notice Julian watching from the window, did not know that he had gone entirely still at the sight of her. Every careful assumption he had made about Eleanor Blackthorne suddenly confirmed and deepened all at once. "Is something wrong, Lord Ashworth?" Duke Alistair asked, noticing the shift in his guest's attention. Julian turned back toward his host, his expression carefully composed once more, though something new had settled behind his eyes, a quiet certainty that had not been there when he arrived. "Not at all," he said. "I simply admired your gardens. They're very well kept." "Thank you," the Duke said, clearly relieved to have avoided whatever had briefly distracted his guest. "We take great pride in them." Julian took his leave shortly after, offering polite farewells to both the Duke and Camille, though his mind remained fixed on the brief glimpse of Eleanor through the window. He climbed into his carriage and sat in thoughtful silence for the length of the ride home, turning over everything he had witnessed. The Duke's easy dismissal of his own daughter, Camille's careful discomfort at the mention of her sister, and beneath it all, the quiet, unmistakable confirmation that the woman he had spoken to so freely at the tea house, the woman whose honesty had lingered in his thoughts for days afterward, was exactly who he had begun to suspect she was. That evening, Julian sat once more with Oliver in his study, the fire casting long shadows across the room as he explained what he had witnessed during the visit. "I want a formal meeting arranged," Julian said. "Not with Camille, with Eleanor." Oliver studied his employer carefully. "The Duke will not be pleased, sir. He has made his intentions regarding Miss Camille quite clear." "I am not interested in what pleases the Duke," Julian said. "I am interested in a woman who spoke to me honestly. without knowing who I was or what I could offer her, at a time when she believed she had nothing to gain from doing so. That is worth far more to me than anything I witnessed in that drawing room today." Oliver allowed himself a small, knowing smile. In 6 years of service, he had rarely seen his employer speak with such quiet conviction. "I will make the arrangements, sir." Across the city, unaware entirely of the decision that had just been made regarding her future, Eleanor sat once more in her modest room, finishing the last pages of her book, thinking of nothing more unusual than the ordinary wait of another day survived. She did not yet know that the wealthy visitor her father and sister had spent the entire day preparing for had come and gone with barely a passing glance at Camille, his true attention fixed elsewhere entirely, on a woman he had not been permitted to see, but had glimpsed anyway, walking quietly among the roses, entirely unaware that her ordinary life was about to change in ways she could not have imagined. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, delivered directly into Duke Alistair's hands by a messenger wearing the Ashworth household colors. He tore it open eagerly, certain it would contain confirmation of a courtship between Julian and Camille, perhaps even the beginnings of a formal proposal. His eyes moved across the elegant handwriting, and with each line, his expression shifted from anticipation to confusion, and finally to something close to disbelief. "This cannot be correct," he muttered, reading the letter a second time. Duchess Margaret, seated across the study reviewing household accounts, looked up at her husband's tone. "What is it?" "Lord Ashworth requests a formal meeting," the Duke said slowly, "with Eleanor." The room went silent for a long moment. Margaret set down her pen. "Eleanor," she repeated, as though the name itself required clarification. "Are you certain there is no error?" "He states her name directly," the Duke said, his voice tightening with each word. "He wishes to call upon her specifically, to discuss a matter of personal interest, at her earliest convenience." For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Duke Alistair found himself without an immediate response. The wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom, a man who had rejected every eligible woman presented to him for the better part of 2 years, was requesting a personal meeting with the daughter he had spent 2 decades treating as an inconvenience best kept out of sight. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said again, though her tone had shifted from confusion to something sharper, something closer to concern. "Perhaps he intends to discuss Camille through Eleanor, some strange formality we are not familiar with." "Perhaps," the Duke said, though he did not sound convinced. When Camille learned of the letter's contents later that evening, her reaction was far less measured than her mother's careful confusion. She stood in the drawing room, her hands clenched at her sides, her composed elegance cracking, for the first time, in longer than the household staff could recall. "This is absurd," she said. "He spent the entire visit speaking with me. He asked about my interests, my education, my accomplishments. Why would he request a meeting with her?" "I do not know," the Duke admitted, pacing the length of the room. "But we cannot refuse such a request, not from a man of his standing." "Then let me accompany her," Camille said quickly. "Let me be present for the meeting. Perhaps he simply wishes to ask her about our household, about our family, before he makes his true intentions known." The Duke considered this for a moment, before nodding slowly. "Yes, that would be sensible. We will not leave Eleanor unsupervised with a man of such importance. Someone must ensure the conversation proceeds appropriately." What neither the Duke nor Camille said aloud, though both clearly understood it, was that neither of them could quite bring themselves to believe Julian Ashworth's interest in Eleanor could be genuine. It seemed, to both of them, more likely to be some strange formality, some misunderstanding, anything other than the simple truth that a man of wealth and standing might find something worth valuing in the daughter they had spent years dismissing. Eleanor learned of the meeting only when her father summoned her to his study that evening, his expression unreadable as he explained the situation. She listened in growing confusion, certain at first that she had misunderstood. "Lord Ashworth wishes to speak with me?" she asked, specifically, not with Camille. "That is what the letter states," her father said, his tone clipped, as though the very words caused him discomfort. "The meeting will take place in 3 days' time. Camille will accompany you, to ensure proper conduct is maintained." Eleanor's mind raced back through recent weeks, searching for any explanation, and it was only then that the memory surfaced fully. The tea house near the harbor, the man with dark hair and thoughtful eyes who had introduced himself simply as Julian, She had never learned his family name. She had never imagined, in the days since their conversation, that the stranger who had listened to her so carefully might be connected in any way to the wealthy bachelor her father had spent an entire day preparing to impress. "I see," she said quietly, though her heart had begun to beat faster, with a mixture of confusion and something else she could not quite name. "You will conduct yourself with appropriate dignity," her father continued, apparently mistaking her silence for nervousness rather than realization. "Whatever strange purpose lies behind this meeting, you will not embarrass this family." "I understand, Father." 3 days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Eleanor found herself unable to focus on her usual routines, her mind returning again and again to the tea-house conversation, wondering if it were truly possible that the man she had spoken to so freely, believing him to be nothing more than a stranger passing through, was in fact Julian Ashworth himself. The thought filled her with a strange, uncertain hope she immediately tried to suppress, unwilling to allow herself the pain of expecting something that might dissolve into disappointment. On the morning of the meeting, Camille appeared at Eleanor's door dressed impeccably, her expression carefully neutral, though the tension beneath her composed exterior was unmistakable to anyone who knew her well. "You should wear something presentable," Camille said, glancing critically at Eleanor's simple gown. "Whatever this meeting is about, we mustn't give him reason to think poorly of this household." Eleanor said nothing, choosing instead a modest but well-made dress from her limited wardrobe, one of the few pieces she owned that had not been selected specifically to minimize her presence in a room. She dressed slowly, her hands steadier than she expected given the uncertainty churning beneath her calm exterior. They received Julian in the estate's smaller drawing room, a space usually reserved for less formal visits. Duke Alistair insisted on being present as well, positioning himself near the fireplace with an air of forced composure, while Margaret remained seated nearby, watching the proceedings with careful, unreadable attention. When Julian entered the room, Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs entirely. It was him. The same dark hair, the same thoughtful eyes, the same quiet, unhurried presence she remembered from the tea-house. And unmistakably, the recognition in his expression when he saw her confirmed everything at once. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, warm and genuine, drew every eye in the room toward her. "Julian," she said softly, unable to keep the surprise fully from her voice. Duke Alistair's expression shifted rapidly, through confusion, disbelief, and finally, something close to alarm. "You are acquainted?" "We met some weeks ago," Julian said, turning toward the Duke with polite formality, though his eyes returned quickly to Eleanor. "Quite by chance, at a tea-house near the harbor. I did not know, at the time, whose household she belonged to." Camille's composed expression had entirely dissolved, replaced by something sharp and disbelieving, as she looked between Julian and her sister. "You spoke with her, before your visit here?" "I did," Julian confirmed, "and I have thought of that conversation quite often since." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Eleanor stood frozen near the doorway, unsure whether to feel joy at the unexpected reunion, or dread at the way her father's expression had darkened with barely restrained fury. A fury she recognized from countless dinners and gatherings, a fury she knew would likely find its way to her the moment their guest departed. "Lord Ashworth," Duke Alistair said carefully, forcing his tone back toward warmth, "perhaps there has been some confusion. Eleanor rarely ventures beyond the estate. Whatever conversation you shared, I am certain it was simply a pleasant, ordinary exchange between strangers, nothing more." "On the contrary," Julian said, his voice calm but firm, "it was the most honest conversation I have had in longer than I can remember, and it is precisely why I requested this meeting." He turned toward Eleanor then, and though the room remained full of tension, his attention seemed to narrow entirely onto her, as though the rest of the household had simply faded from relevance. "I would like your permission," he said, "to call upon you formally. Not out of any obligation to your family, and not for any reason beyond the conversation we shared, and my hope that it might continue." Eleanor felt every eye in the room turned toward her, her father's furious disbelief, Camille's stunned outrage, her stepmother's careful, calculating silence. But beneath all of it, she felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt seen, not for her family name, not for what she might offer someone, but simply for who she was. "I would like that," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of every gaze upon her. Very much. Duke Alistair's jaw tightened, his composure cracking visibly at the edges, though he said nothing further in the moment, aware that any outward objection would only draw more attention to a situation he clearly did not know how to control. Camille sat rigid and silent, her carefully constructed world of expectation crumbling before her eyes, unable to fully process how the sister she had spent her entire life overshadowing had suddenly, impossibly, become the center of everyone's attention. Julian remained a while longer, speaking briefly with the Duke about matters of little consequence, though his true purpose had already been achieved. When he finally rose to take his leave, he paused beside Eleanor one final time. "I will call again soon," he said quietly, meant only for her. "If that would please you." "It would," she said. After he departed, the drawing room remained silent for a long, heavy moment, before Duke Alistair finally turned toward Eleanor, his composure entirely gone, replaced by something colder and more dangerous than she had seen from him in years. "Explain yourself," he said. "There is nothing to explain, Father," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I met a stranger. We spoke honestly. He wishes to know me better. I see no fault in that." "You will not embarrass this family," her father said, his voice low and sharp, "by entangling yourself with a man far above your station, based on nothing more than some chance encounter." "He came to this house, Father," Eleanor said quietly, "asking specifically for me. Not for Camille, not for you, for me." The words hung in the air, unmistakable in their meaning, and for the first time in Eleanor's entire life, she watched her father struggle to find a response that would restore the order he had always taken for granted. News of Julian's visit spread through the capital faster than anyone in House Blackthorn could control. Within days, the drawing rooms of noble society buzzed with a single question, repeated in hushed, excited tones at every gathering. Was it true that Julian Ashworth, the man who had rejected every eligible woman in the kingdom, had personally requested to court the Duke's overlooked eldest daughter? Duke Alistair found the attention unbearable. For years, his household's social standing had rested comfortably on Camille's beauty and charm, on the quiet assumption that she would someday secure a match worthy of the family name. Now, that assumption had been upended entirely, and worse, it had been upended by the daughter he had spent 2 decades treating as an afterthought. "We must control this situation," he said one evening, pacing his study while Margaret sat quietly nearby, and Camille stood near the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "If word spreads that Lord Ashworth's interest is genuine, it will raise questions about why we have kept Eleanor so removed from society all these years. Then we simply say she preferred privacy," Margaret offered carefully. "That she was always a quiet, reserved girl, uninterested in the noise of social gatherings." "That will not hold," Camille said sharply. "Not once people begin asking her directly. She isn't foolish, whatever else she may be. She'll tell the truth if pressed." The Duke's expression darkened further. "Then we ensure she is never given the opportunity to be pressed. Camille, you will remain close to your sister during any social engagement Lord Ashworth attends. You will guide the conversation, present the family favorably, and ensure Eleanor does not say anything that might damage our reputation." Camille's jaw tightened, though she said nothing in protest. The instruction was not truly about protecting the family's reputation, and all 3 of them understood this clearly, even if none of them spoke it aloud. It was about maintaining Camille's position, about preventing her sister's sudden, unexpected rise from eclipsing her own carefully cultivated standing. Over the following weeks, Julian called upon Eleanor several times, each visit conducted under the watchful, uncomfortable presence of her family. They walked the estate's gardens together, always trailed at a careful distance by Camille or Margaret, and though the supervision limited their conversation's privacy, it did nothing to diminish the ease that had existed between them since their very first meeting. "Your family seems determined to ensure we are never alone," Julian observed during one such walk, glancing back toward Camille, who trailed several paces behind them with an expression of carefully maintained boredom. "They do not trust easily," Eleanor said. "With least of all where I am concerned." "And what do you think," Julian asked quietly, "when they speak of you the way they do?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I think I stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. It is easier that way. Expectation only leads to disappointment in this household." That should not be true, Julian said, his voice carrying a quiet firmness that made Eleanor glance toward him in surprise. You deserve better than simply learning to expect less. She did not know how to respond to such directness, unused to anyone speaking so plainly in her defense. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Eleanor found herself, not for the first time, wishing desperately that the walk could continue indefinitely, free from the watchful presence trailing behind them. Camille's frustration, meanwhile, continued to build with each passing visit. She had spent her entire life secure in the knowledge that she was the daughter their father favored, the daughter society admired, the daughter destined for a match worthy of admiration. Watching Julian's clear, growing affection for Eleanor unsettled something in her she had never before been forced to confront, a jealousy sharp enough to override her usual careful composure. It was during a garden party hosted by a neighboring noble family that Camille's frustration finally found an outlet. Eleanor had arrived alongside her family, and though she remained largely at the edges of the gathering, as was her habit, Julian sought her out almost immediately upon his own arrival, drawing more than a few curious glances from the assembled guests. "Miss Eleanor," Julian said warmly, offering a small bow as he approached. "I did not expect to see you here. My father insisted," Eleanor admitted, "though I confess I would have preferred to remain at home." "Then allow me to make your evening more bearable," Julian said, offering his arm. They spent much of the party together, walking among the garden paths, speaking quietly, while the rest of the gathering buzzed with whispered speculation around them. It was, without question, the most visible display of Julian's affection yet, and Camille watched it unfold from across the garden with an expression that grew increasingly difficult to hide. "You must do something," she hissed quietly to her father, finding him near the refreshment tables. "Everyone is watching them. This is humiliating." "Patience," the Duke murmured, though his own composure had grown visibly strained. "These things do not last. Infatuation fades quickly enough, especially once he understands the truth of her situation." But as the weeks continued and Julian's visits grew more frequent rather than less, it became increasingly clear that whatever the Duke had hoped would fade was, instead, growing steadily stronger. Whispers began to circulate, not just about the surprising match itself, but about the household that had, for so many years, kept its eldest daughter hidden away. It was Camille who finally decided, in a moment of desperate frustration, that quieter methods were required. She began, carefully and deliberately, to plant small comments among their social circle, comments designed to cast doubt on Eleanor's character, without appearing to come from any malicious intent. "She's always been rather withdrawn," Camille would say, with practiced sympathy, whenever Eleanor's name arose in conversation. "I do worry, sometimes, whether she fully understands how to conduct herself in society. She's led such a sheltered life." The comments were subtle, never outright cruel, but they carried an unmistakable undertone, planting doubts that spread quietly through the same social circles that had, only weeks earlier, been buzzing with curious admiration for the unexpected match. Eleanor, unaware of the whispers building against her, continued her visits with Julian, cherishing each conversation without understanding the quiet campaign being waged against her in the background. It was Grace, ever watchful, who first brought the rumors to Eleanor's attention. "You should know what is being said," Grace told her one evening, her expression troubled. "There are whispers, Miss Eleanor, about your character, about whether you are truly suited for someone of Lord Ashworth's standing." Eleanor felt a familiar cold settle into her chest, the particular ache of being discussed and judged by people who knew nothing true about her. "Where do these whispers come from?" Grace hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer directly, but Eleanor's steady gaze eventually drew the truth from her. "I have heard your sister's name mentioned, more than once, in connection with such comments." Eleanor absorbed this information quietly, feeling something shift inside her, not quite anger, but a weary recognition of a pattern she had witnessed her entire life. Camille had never needed to say anything outright cruel to wound her. She had always understood, with practiced precision, exactly how to plant doubt without ever appearing to be its source. That evening, Eleanor confronted her sister directly, finding Camille alone in the estate's music room, practicing a piece on the piano with careful, deliberate focus. "I have heard what you have been saying about me," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the hurt lodged beneath it. Camille's fingers paused over the keys, though she did not turn immediately to face her sister. I do not know what you mean. Do not insult me by pretending otherwise, Eleanor said. I have spent my entire life allowing this family to diminish me without complaint. I will not allow it to continue now, simply because my happiness has become inconvenient to you. Camille finally turned, and for a brief, unguarded moment, something raw and honest flickered across her expression. An emotion far more complicated than simple jealousy. Do you have any idea, she said quietly, what it is like to watch someone effortlessly receive the very thing you have spent your entire life working toward? I have been groomed since childhood to secure a match worthy of admiration, and now, entirely by accident, without even trying, you have found exactly that. I did not seek this out to spite you, Eleanor said. I simply spoke honestly to a stranger, at a time when I believed I had nothing to gain by doing so. That is precisely what makes it worse, Camille said bitterly. The conversation ended without resolution, both sisters retreating to their respective corners of a household that had never truly allowed either of them the space to be fully honest with one another. But something had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in the days that followed. Eleanor found herself standing a little taller in social gatherings, addressing the quiet whispers directly whenever they arose, refusing to allow herself to shrink the way she once had. Julian, sensing the growing tension within her family, began to make his support increasingly public, defending Eleanor openly whenever he witnessed even the smallest slight against her, his affection for her deepening, with each passing week, into something neither of them could any longer deny. It was only a matter of time before the quiet campaign against Eleanor collided directly with Julian's growing determination to protect her, and when that collision finally came, it would unravel far more than anyone in House Blackthorn had anticipated. The invitation to the winter gala arrived at House Blackthorn with the kind of grand formality reserved for the capital's most important social event of the season, hosted this year by a duchess known throughout the kingdom for her sharp eye and sharper tongue. Duke Alistair had spent weeks anticipating the gathering, certain it would provide the perfect opportunity to finally repair the damage done to Camille's standing, to redirect attention back toward his younger daughter, and away from the growing scandal surrounding Eleanor's unexpected courtship. This is our chance, he told Camille the morning of the event, watching as her lady's maid arranged an elaborate updo, threaded with small jeweled pins. Every important family in the kingdom will be present. You must shine brighter than you ever have. And Eleanor? Camille asked, glancing at her reflection with practiced composure. Eleanor will attend as well, the Duke said, his tone clipped. We cannot exclude her without drawing further suspicion, but you will ensure she does not overshadow the evening. Eleanor, dressing in her own modest rooms with only Grace for company, felt none of the anxious anticipation gripping the rest of her household. She had grown, in recent weeks, more comfortable in her own presence, steadier in the knowledge that Julian's regard for her had nothing to do with performance or approval from anyone else. Still, she understood the evening would be difficult, aware of the whispers that continued to circulate, despite her attempts to address them directly. You look lovely, Grace said, adjusting the final fold of Eleanor's deep green gown, simple compared to Camille's elaborate finery, but well suited to her nonetheless. Whatever happens tonight, remember that. Thank you, Grace, Eleanor said softly. I don't know what I would do without you. The gala hall glittered with candlelight and crystal, filled with the kingdom's most influential families, dressed in their finest, the air thick with music and the low hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations. Eleanor arrived alongside her family, immediately aware of the curious glances that followed her through the room, whispers she had grown accustomed to but never entirely comfortable with. Julian found her within the first half hour, his expression brightening the moment he spotted her across the crowded hall. You came, he said, taking her hand with warm familiarity that drew more than a few curious stares from nearby guests. I worried you might not, given the circumstances. I would not have missed it, Eleanor said, though her voice carried a faint tension she could not fully disguise. They spent much of the evening together, dancing when the music allowed it, speaking quietly during the pauses between, and for a while, Eleanor allowed herself to forget the whispers, to simply enjoy the warmth of Julian's attention and the growing certainty she felt in his affection for her. But the peace did not last. It began quietly, a comment overheard near the refreshment tables, spoken just loudly enough to ensure it reached the right ears. I heard she was engaged to another man entirely, just weeks before Lord Ashworth's interest began. One wonders what kind of woman abandons one arrangement so easily the moment a wealthier prospect appears. Eleanor froze, recognizing the deliberate cruelty behind the words, aware immediately of who might have planted such a comment among the gathered guests. She turned to find Camille standing several paces away, engaged in seemingly innocent conversation with a cluster of noblewomen, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor, with an expression that confirmed everything. Julian, standing beside Eleanor, had heard the comment as well, his expression darkening with barely restrained anger. "That is a lie," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the nearby guests. Eleanor's engagement was arranged entirely without her consent, by her own father, for reasons that had nothing to do with her wishes. She has done nothing dishonorable. The nearby conversation stuttered into uncomfortable silence, several guests turning to observe the unfolding confrontation with poorly disguised curiosity. Duke Alastair, catching sight of the commotion from across the hall, made his way quickly toward them, his expression a careful mask of concerned composure. "Lord Ashworth," the Duke said, forcing warmth into his tone. "Perhaps this is not the appropriate setting for such discussions." "On the contrary," Julian said, turning toward the Duke with cold precision. "I believe this is precisely the setting where such discussions should occur, given that false rumors about Eleanor's character continue to circulate, seemingly originating from within her own household." The Duke's expression tightened. "I am certain there has been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," Julian said. "I have watched, over these past weeks, as Eleanor has been consistently diminished, excluded, and spoken of with contempt by the very people who should be protecting her. I will not stand by silently while it continues." The confrontation drew the attention of nearly every guest within earshot, the gala's usual hum of polite conversation fading into hushed, fascinated silence as the scene unfolded. Camille, unable to remain in the background any longer, stepped forward, her composure finally cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. "You have no understanding of our family," she said sharply, her voice carrying an edge sharper than her usual careful tone. "You have known Eleanor for mere weeks. You cannot possibly claim to understand the complexities of our household." "I understand enough," Julian said, turning toward her, "to recognize cruelty when I witness it directly. I have seen your father dismiss her existence at his own table. I have heard the whispers you yourself have planted among your social circles, and I have watched Eleanor endure all of it with more dignity than either of you have shown in this entire conversation." Eleanor stood frozen amid the unfolding scene, acutely aware of every eye in the crowded hall now fixed upon her family's public unraveling. Part of her wanted desperately to retreat, to disappear into the safety of anonymity she had spent her entire life cultivating. But another part of her, quieter but growing steadily stronger, recognized that this moment offered something she had never before been given: the chance to speak her own truth in front of the very people who had spent years defining her by her father's cruelty. "He is right," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt beneath her calm exterior. Every head in the vicinity turned toward her. "My father has spent my entire life treating me as an embarrassment," she continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "He has compared me publicly to my sister at nearly every gathering I have attended. He arranged my engagement to a man I hardly knew, without ever asking whether it was something I wanted. I have said nothing of this before tonight, because I believed, as I was taught to believe, that my silence was simply the price of remaining part of this family." "Eleanor," Duke Alastair said sharply, his composure entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to panic, as he registered the growing audience around them. "This is not the place." "It is exactly the place," Eleanor said, turning to face him fully, "because you have never once cared where or when you chose to humiliate me. I see no reason to extend you a courtesy you have never once extended to me." The hall had grown entirely silent now, save for the distant, oblivious strains of music still drifting from the orchestra at the far end of the room. Duke Alastair stood frozen, his face flushed with a mixture of fury and mortification, aware suddenly of just how many important guests had witnessed his daughter's quiet, devastating dismantling of the careful reputation he had spent decades constructing. "You will regret this," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear it. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I have spent far too long regretting my own silence instead." Julian stepped closer to her side, his presence steady and unwavering. "Eleanor owes this family nothing further," he said, addressing the Duke directly. "And I will not permit her to be spoken to in such a manner again, in this household or anywhere else." The Duke's jaw worked silently for a moment, clearly searching for some response that might salvage the situation, but finding nothing that would not further expose the very cruelty Eleanor had just described in front of half the kingdom's noble families. Eventually, he turned sharply and withdrew from the hall entirely, Camille following closely behind him, her face pale with the realization that the careful social order she had spent her entire life relying upon had just crumbled in full view of everyone who mattered. The gathering slowly resumed its usual rhythm, though the whispered conversations that followed carried an entirely different tone than before, no longer questioning Eleanor's character, but instead turning curious, sympathetic attention toward the quiet dignity she had shown in the face of such public humiliation. "Are you all right?" Julian asked quietly, once the immediate crowd had dispersed. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had begun to fade. "I have never spoken to my father that way before. I don't know what comes next." "Whatever comes next," Julian said, taking her hand gently, "you will not face it alone." Eleanor looked up at him, something steady and certain settling within her, despite the chaos of the evening. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like an embarrassment to be hidden away, a burden to be managed. She felt, simply, like herself, fully seen and fully accepted, standing beside someone who had chosen her not out of obligation or convenience, but because he genuinely valued who she was. They remained at the gala a while longer, though the evening's earlier warmth had been replaced by a quieter, more resolved atmosphere. As they finally prepared to depart, Julian paused beside her near the entrance hall. "There is something I must attend to," he said carefully, "regarding your father's affairs. I have had some concerns, for a while now, about certain irregularities in his management of the estate's finances. I believe it is time I looked into them more closely." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at his words, though she said nothing to discourage him. She thought of the ledgers she had reviewed privately over the past 2 years, the unexplained expenses, the payments to unfamiliar names. She had never understood fully what they meant, only that something about her father's stewardship of the family's wealth felt less honest than it should have. "Do what you believe is right," she said finally. "I have spent enough of my life protecting a man who never once protected me in return." Julian nodded, something resolute settling into his expression. Neither of them could have known, standing together in the quiet entrance hall as the gala's music continued faintly behind them, just how much further the coming weeks would unravel the careful foundation upon which House Blackthorn had always rested. Nathaniel Cole had built his reputation as one of the capital's most thorough financial investigators over nearly 15 years of quiet, meticulous work, uncovering irregularities that others had missed, and doing so with a discretion that made him the preferred choice for delicate matters among the kingdom's wealthiest families. When Julian summoned him to his study the week following the gala, he arrived prepared for a complicated task, though even he found himself surprised by the scope of what he eventually uncovered. "I want a complete review of Duke Blackthorn's finances," Julian said, sliding a folder of preliminary documents across his desk. "Every transaction from the past 5 years, every debt, every payment, every source of income." Nathaniel studied the documents briefly, before looking up. "May I ask what has prompted this particular investigation, sir?" "Concerns about the treatment of someone under his care," Julian said simply, "and a suspicion that his public reputation may not align with the reality of his household's finances." It took Nathaniel nearly 3 weeks of careful investigation to assemble a complete picture, weeks during which Julian continued his visits to Eleanor, watching as the atmosphere within House Blackthorn grew increasingly tense following the public confrontation at the gala. The Duke, humiliated in front of the capital's most influential families, had grown colder and more withdrawn, his usual cutting remarks toward Eleanor replaced by an icy, watchful silence that unsettled her more than his previous cruelty ever had. When Nathaniel finally returned to Julian's study with his complete findings, his expression carried the particular gravity of someone who understood the weight of what he was about to reveal. "It is worse than I initially suspected," Nathaniel said, laying out a series of documents across the desk. Duke Blackthorn has, for the better part of 4 years, been systematically misappropriating funds meant for the estate's tenant farmers and household staff. Wages have gone unpaid, or significantly reduced, while the Duke's own personal expenditures, gambling debts in particular, have grown substantially. Julian studied the documents carefully, his expression darkening with each new revelation. "How much are we discussing?" "A significant sum," Nathaniel said. "Enough that several of his creditors have grown increasingly impatient. There are also indications that he has borrowed heavily against the estate itself, using falsified valuations to secure loans he has little genuine ability to repay. Should this become public knowledge, the household's financial ruin would be all but guaranteed." Julian sat back in his chair, absorbing the full weight of what he had learned. He thought of Eleanor's private ledger reviews, mentioned briefly during one of their conversations, her quiet observation that certain expenses within the household had never seemed to add up properly. She had noticed the irregularities long before anyone else had thought to investigate them, though she had never possessed the standing or resources to act on her suspicions. "I want this information compiled formally," Julian said, "prepared in a manner that could be presented, if necessary, to the appropriate authorities." "May I ask your intentions, sir?" Nathaniel asked carefully. "I have not yet decided," Julian admitted honestly, "but I believe the Duke should understand the full extent of what has been uncovered, before any decision is made regarding how to proceed." The following week, Julian requested a private meeting with Duke Alistair, a request the Duke accepted with visible reluctance, likely assuming it concerned formal arrangements regarding Eleanor's future rather than anything more troubling. He received Julian in his study, forcing a strained cordiality into his demeanor as they settled into chairs across from one another. "Lord Ashworth," the Duke said, "I trust this visit concerns your intentions toward my daughter." "In part," Julian said, though his tone carried none of the warmth the Duke had likely anticipated. "But there is another matter I believe requires your attention first." He slid the compiled documents across the desk, watching carefully as the Duke's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as he flipped through page after page of carefully documented evidence. Evidence that left little room for denial or explanation. "Where did you obtain these?" the Duke demanded, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Through a thorough and entirely legitimate investigation," Julian said calmly. "One that reveals, quite clearly, that you have spent the past several years mismanaging your household's finances, underpaying your staff, and borrowing against your estate under increasingly desperate circumstances." The Duke's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he set the documents down on the desk before him. "What is it you intend to do with this information?" "That depends," Julian said, "on how you choose to proceed from this point forward." Over the following days, word of the Duke's financial troubles began to circulate through the capital's noble circles, spreading with the same rapid, unstoppable momentum that had characterized the earlier rumors surrounding Eleanor's courtship. Whether the information had been deliberately released, or had simply found its way into circulation through the natural gossip of servants and creditors, the effect was the same. House Blackthorn's carefully maintained reputation collapsed within a matter of weeks. Creditors, who had previously extended the Duke considerable patience, based on his social standing, began demanding immediate repayment. Social invitations that had once arrived regularly slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether, as families who had once courted the Duke's favor now quietly distanced themselves from the growing scandal. Camille, whose entire sense of identity had been built upon her family's social standing, found herself increasingly excluded from gatherings she had once attended as a matter of course, watching helplessly as the foundation of her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Eleanor, observing her family's unraveling from the periphery, felt an unexpected complexity of emotion. She had spent her entire life enduring her father's cruelty, and some part of her recognized a grim justice in watching the consequences of his own choices finally catch up to him. But another part of her, the part that still remembered fragments of tenderness from early childhood before her mother's death, felt an ache she had not expected, a sadness for the household that might have been, had things been different. It was during this period of upheaval that Julian came to her with a difficult question. "You have every right," he said carefully, sitting with her in the quiet of the estate's garden, "to decide how this situation proceeds. I can ensure the full extent of your father's actions becomes formally known, resulting in significant legal consequences. Or, if you prefer, matters could be resolved more quietly, with your father simply required to make amends to those he has wronged, without further public exposure. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light filter through the garden's carefully tended roses. "What would you do?" she asked eventually, "if the choice were yours?" "I would want justice for those who have been genuinely harmed," Julian said honestly. "The staff who went unpaid, the tenants who suffered under his mismanagement. But I would not seek revenge simply for its own sake, particularly not against a man whose own family has already suffered enough under his cruelty." Eleanor nodded slowly, something settling within her as she reached her decision. "I do not want revenge," she said finally. "I want my father to face genuine consequences for the harm he has caused others, the staff, the tenants, the people who trusted him and were failed by that trust. But I have no desire to destroy what remains of this family, simply to punish him further for the years he spent making me feel unwanted." "That is a generous choice," Julian said quietly. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "or perhaps it is simply the choice that allows me to finally walk away from this household with my own conscience intact, rather than carrying his cruelty forward as something of my own." The resolution, when it finally came, required Duke Alistair to formally repay the wages owed to his staff and tenants, using funds raised through the sale of several of the estate's smaller properties, a humbling and public admission of his mismanagement that stripped away much of the wealth and standing he had once taken for granted. He would retain his title, though the damage to his reputation would linger for years to come, a quiet, permanent reminder of the consequences of his choices. Eleanor, for her part, made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than remaining within the household to witness her father's slow, humbled reconstruction, she chose instead to formally separate herself from House Blackthorn entirely, requesting only a modest independent allowance, sufficient to establish her own quiet life away from the estate that had never truly felt like home. "You do not need to remain connected to any of this," Julian told her gently, as she prepared to leave the estate for what she intended to be the final time. "Not to your father's redemption, and not to his consequences. You are free to build whatever life you choose now." Eleanor stood for a long moment in the entrance hall where, years earlier, she had knelt to gather the pieces of a shattered plate, while her father's guests laughed quietly around her. The hall looked much the same as it always had, grand and cold and unwelcoming, but she felt, standing within it one final time, entirely unburdened by its weight for the first time in her life. "I am ready," she said finally, turning toward the door, and toward Julian, and toward whatever came next. The small house Julian had arranged for Eleanor sat on a quiet street near the edge of the capital, modest by the standards of the estate she had grown up in, but filled with a warmth that House Blackthorn had never once possessed. Eleanor spent her first weeks there simply learning what it felt like to exist without the constant weight of comparison, without the careful calculation of how to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable in a room. Grace, who had requested and received permission to leave the Blackthorn household's employment, joined Eleanor in her new life, no longer as a servant bound by duty, but as a genuine friend. The two of them spending long evenings together discussing books and plans, and the small, ordinary pleasures neither of them had been permitted to fully enjoy before. "I never imagined I would see you like this," Grace said one evening, watching Eleanor laugh freely at some small joke, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable within her father's household. "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "I had grown so used to bracing myself for the next cruelty that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist without fear." Julian visited often during those weeks, their courtship continuing with the same honest ease that had characterized their very first conversation at the tea house, though now unburdened by the watchful, suspicious presence of Eleanor's family. They walked together through the capital's quieter streets, attended small gatherings among friends who valued genuine connection over social calculation, and slowly, steadily, built something neither of them had quite dared to hope for. "I have been thinking," Julian said one evening, as they sat together in the small garden behind Eleanor's new home, the last light of sunset painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, "about what comes next for us." Eleanor turned to him, something warm and hopeful stirring in her chest. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I would very much like to marry you," Julian said simply, "not out of any obligation, and not because it would please anyone's expectations, but because I have never known anyone whose honesty and quiet strength I admire more than yours." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, though they carried none of the pain that had so often accompanied her tears in the past. "I would like that very much," she said. Their engagement, when formally announced, drew considerable attention throughout the capital, though the nature of the attention had shifted entirely from the whispered speculation that had once surrounded Eleanor's unexpected courtship. Now, the conversations carried genuine warmth, admiration, for a woman who had endured years of quiet cruelty and emerged from it not bitter or broken, but stronger and more clearly herself than ever before. Camille, whose own life had grown considerably quieter following the collapse of House Blackthorn's social standing, sent a brief letter to Eleanor upon hearing news of the engagement, an unexpected gesture given the tension that had defined their relationship for so long. "I do not know if I have any right to offer congratulations," the letter read, "given everything that has passed between us, but I find myself, in the quiet of these past months, reflecting a great deal on the ways I allowed jealousy and fear to shape how I treated you. I cannot undo the years of unkindness, but I wanted you to know that I see now, more clearly than I once did, the strength it must have taken you to endure what you endured, and the grace it took to choose the path you chose, rather than seeking to destroy what remained of our family. I wish you genuine happiness, Eleanor. You have earned it." Eleanor read the letter several times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she had not expected. She did not know if the years of hurt could ever be fully resolved between them, but she recognized, in her sister's careful words, something that resembled genuine growth, and she found herself, despite everything, hoping that Camille might eventually find her own path toward a life built on something more genuine than the fragile foundation of appearances she had been raised to value above all else. She wrote back a brief, careful response, neither dismissing the pain of their shared past nor closing the door entirely on some distant possibility of reconciliation. It was, she decided, enough for now. A small bridge left standing between two sisters who had spent their entire lives shaped by the same cruel household, in very different ways. Duke Alistair, meanwhile, remained largely absent from Eleanor's new life, their relationship reduced to occasional, formal correspondence handled through legal representatives regarding the terms of her independence from the estate. Eleanor felt no particular urge to seek out a deeper reconciliation with the father who had spent 2 decades making her feel unwanted, though she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer carried the sharp, constant anger she might have expected. He had made his choices, she had made hers, and for the first time in her life, her own happiness no longer depended in any way upon his approval or acknowledgement. The wedding, when it finally took place on a bright spring afternoon, nearly a year after their first meeting at the quiet tea house near the harbor, was a modest affair by the standards of the capital's noble society, attended primarily by genuine friends, rather than the calculated social obligations that had once defined every gathering within House Blackthorn. Grace stood proudly among the guests, along with Oliver and Nathaniel and several others who had, in their own quiet ways, supported Eleanor and Julian throughout their journey toward this moment. Eleanor wore a simple gown of pale blue, nothing like the elaborate finery Camille had once worn to impress a household's expectations, and as she walked toward Julian, beneath a canopy of blossoming trees, she felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she was stepping into a future built entirely on her own terms. "You look happy," Julian said quietly, as they stood together following the ceremony, watching their small gathering of guests mingle beneath the soft afternoon sun. "I am happy," Eleanor said, and she meant it more fully than she had ever meant anything in her life. "For the first time, I think I understand what that word truly means." In the years that followed, Eleanor built a life defined not by the cruel comparisons and quiet humiliations of her childhood, but by genuine partnership, mutual respect, and the steady, unwavering support of a husband who had chosen her precisely because of who she was, rather than in spite of it. She continued her interest in financial matters, eventually working alongside Nathaniel on projects supporting fair wages and honest business practices throughout the capital, using the painful lessons of her own family's mismanagement to help protect others from similar harm. Camille, in time, found her own quiet path forward as well, eventually marrying a modest merchant whose genuine affection for her had nothing to do with the social standing her family name had once carried. It was not the grand match she had spent her childhood expecting, but it was, in its own way, more honest than anything she had known within House Blackthorn, and slowly, gradually, the relationship between the two sisters began to heal, built not on the competitive comparisons of their childhood, but on a shared understanding of everything they had both survived. Duke Alistair lived out his remaining years in considerably reduced circumstances, his health declining steadily under the weight of his diminished standing and the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust with those he had wronged. Eleanor visited him only rarely, and always with careful boundaries firmly maintained, though she found, in those final years, a strange and unexpected peace in simply no longer needing anything from him, neither his approval nor his apology, in order to feel whole. On quiet evenings, sitting together in the garden of the home they had built, Julian would sometimes ask Eleanor if she ever regretted the painful years that had preceded their meeting, the decades of cruelty and dismissal that had shaped so much of who she had become. "I do not regret them," Eleanor told him once, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft, familiar colors. "They were difficult, and I would not wish them upon anyone. But they taught me something I might never have learned otherwise, that my worth was never truly dependent on anyone else's recognition of it. I simply had to survive long enough to discover that truth for myself." Julian took her hand gently, watching the same sunset beside her. "And I am endlessly grateful," he said, "that you did." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder, finally, fully at peace within a life she had built entirely on her own terms, surrounded by people who valued her, not despite who she was, but precisely because of it. 2 years into their marriage, a letter arrived at Eleanor and Julian's home that neither of them expected, sealed with a crest neither immediately recognized. Eleanor opened it at the breakfast table, her expression shifting to confusion as she read the contents aloud. "It's from Lord Hallow," she said slowly, "the man I was once engaged to." Julian set down his cup, his attention sharpening immediately. "What does he want?" Eleanor read further, her brow furrowing. "He claims that our broken engagement caused him significant financial and social damage, and he is requesting compensation, or else he intends to bring the matter before a magistrate, framing it as a breach of promise." It was, on its surface, a request without much genuine legal standing, given that the engagement had been arranged entirely by Duke Alistair and dissolved through no fault or scheming of Eleanor's own. But Lord Hallow, having spent the past 2 years watching his own fortunes decline, while Eleanor's had risen dramatically through her marriage to one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom, seemed determined to extract some benefit from the situation, regardless of the legal merit behind his claim. "He has no genuine case," Julian said, though his tone carried a note of caution. "But a public dispute, even a baseless one, could create unwanted attention, particularly given how much scrutiny your family's affairs have already faced." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest, the old instinct to simply absorb the situation quietly, to avoid drawing further attention to herself, rather than risk confrontation. But she recognized the instinct now for what it was, a remnant of years spent believing her own comfort mattered less than everyone else's convenience, and she made a deliberate choice to set it aside. "I will not be intimidated into paying a man simply to avoid inconvenience," she said firmly. "If he wishes to bring this before a magistrate, then let him. I have nothing to hide, and I trust the truth will hold up under scrutiny." Nathaniel, consulted once again for his careful expertise, quickly uncovered that Lord Hallow's financial troubles ran far deeper than a single broken engagement could explain. Years of poor management and reckless spending that had little to do with Eleanor at all. Armed with this information, along with clear documentation proving the engagement had been arranged and dissolved entirely through Duke Alistair's decisions, rather than any fault of Eleanor's, Julian arranged a private meeting with Lord Hallow before the matter could escalate any further. The meeting took place in a quiet office in the capital, Lord Hallow arriving with a nervous bravado that quickly faltered once Julian laid out the full extent of what had been discovered. "You have no legitimate claim," Julian said calmly, sliding the documentation across the table. "Your debts predate any connection to Eleanor by several years. Should you choose to pursue this matter publicly, I will ensure the full truth of your circumstances becomes known as well, and I do not believe that outcome would serve you favorably." Lord Hallow's bravado crumbled entirely under the weight of the evidence, and within the week, he withdrew his claim entirely, quietly disappearing from the capital's social circles not long after, his reputation unable to withstand even the threat of public scrutiny that Julian's investigation had prepared. Eleanor felt, in the aftermath of the resolved dispute, a quiet satisfaction, unlike anything she had experienced during her years within her father's household. She had faced a genuine threat directly, without shrinking or retreating, and had emerged from it not through anyone else's protection alone, but through her own steady insistence on standing firmly in her own truth. "You did not need me for that," Julian observed later, watching her with quiet admiration. "You would have handled it regardless." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I am glad I did not have to handle it alone." There is a difference between needing someone's protection and simply valuing their partnership. Life continued to unfold steadily in the years that followed, filled with the ordinary rhythms of a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than obligation. Eleanor's work alongside Nathaniel expanded considerably, eventually leading to the establishment of a modest organization dedicated to reviewing the financial practices of noble estates, ensuring tenant farmers and household staff received fair and honest treatment, a project born directly from the painful lessons of her own childhood. It was during one such investigation, nearly 4 years after her marriage to Julian, that Eleanor found herself unexpectedly confronting a household eerily similar to the one she had grown up within. A noble family, whose eldest daughter, plain and quiet, was routinely dismissed and compared unfavorably to a more celebrated younger sibling. Eleanor recognized the pattern immediately, the careful, practiced silence of a young woman who had learned to expect nothing kinder than indifference from her own family. "You do not need to accept this as simply the way things are," Eleanor told the young woman quietly, during a private moment away from the rest of the household's attention. "I once believed the same thing about my own life. I was wrong." The young woman, whose name was Charlotte, looked at Eleanor with an expression of cautious, hesitant hope, the same expression Eleanor herself might have worn years earlier, had anyone ever offered her similar words of encouragement. "How did you find the strength to leave?" Charlotte asked. "I did not find it all at once," Eleanor admitted honestly. "It came slowly, through small moments of honesty, through people who saw value in me, that I had not yet learned to see in myself. It is possible, Charlotte. It simply requires patience, and the willingness to stop waiting for permission from people who have already shown you they will never truly give it." Eleanor could not solve every difficulty within Charlotte's household during a single visit, nor did she attempt to. But she left behind something she recognized as valuable beyond measure, the simple, steady knowledge that her situation was not permanent, that kindness and genuine partnership existed beyond the walls of a household determined to diminish her. That evening, returning home to Julian, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had led her from a lonely, overlooked daughter, kneeling to gather broken porcelain in a cold banquet hall, to a woman capable of offering genuine hope to others trapped within similarly painful circumstances. "You seem thoughtful this evening," Julian observed, settling beside her in the quiet warmth of their garden. "I am simply grateful," Eleanor said, "for everything that led me here, even the painful parts. I would not have become who I am without them, and I would not trade who I have become for anything, no matter how difficult the path required to reach it." Julian took her hand gently, the same steady gesture that had comforted her through so many difficult moments over the years, and together they sat in comfortable silence, watching the evening settle softly around them, secure in a life built entirely on honesty, mutual respect, and a partnership neither of them had ever taken for granted. Years later, when people spoke of Eleanor Ashworth throughout the capital, they no longer spoke of her as the Duke's overlooked eldest daughter, nor as simply the wife of the kingdom's wealthiest bachelor. They spoke of her as a woman who had transformed her own painful history into a genuine force for change, who had proven, through her own quiet, determined example, that a person's worth was never truly defined by the cruelty of those who failed to recognize it. And on quiet evenings, when Eleanor allowed herself to remember the young woman who had once knelt silently on a cold marble floor, gathering broken porcelain while laughter echoed cruelly around her, she felt not pain, but a deep and abiding gratitude for the long, difficult journey that had ultimately led her toward a life defined not by what she had endured, but by everything she had chosen to become despite it.